When I was probably, I guess I'll wait a second as I boogie, but I think I was probably about 13 or 14, and I experienced what to this day I think I would still dub as my most embarrassing moment. And unfortunately, throughout this morning of this event, it was a pretty long one. But I decided one summer, because I had an older friend who got me involved in the sport of mountain biking through, in central Iowa, where there's lots of mountains and things. I thought I was an expert. And besides, I had a Kmart special of a bike, and I knew what I was doing at this point. So I thought, it's time to take it to the next level. I'm going to sign up for a race. And so I did that. And as I'm signing up for this race, there's some different categories. There was like the kids race. That was about a 1.5 mile race, and there was a category for young teens like me, and I thought, no, that's sissy stuff. I'm not signing up for that. And then there was what was called a beginner, a sport, and an expert division. And I thought, well, expert, that's for Lance Armstrong for mountain biking. That's his category. I better not go there. Sport division, I'd like to win this race, so I'm not going to go in that category, so let's go with the beginner category. So I decided to go with the beginner category, which, as I'm reading the rules, I've never done this before, brand new sport to my family. And I read that it's a 5-mile loop. And I think, 1.5 miles, 5 miles, I can do a 5-mile mountain bike race. So I sign up for this race, and I get to the morning of, and you kind of get those jitters in you. You get kind of nervous, so I wasn't very hungry that morning, and I decided, I guess it was wise, contrary to my father's pleading, that I was going to skip breakfast. I just didn't feel like eating much, and so I didn't. I'd also decided, since I have a Kmart special and not a really nice bike, that I have a lot of weight that I'm carrying already, so I'm not going to take any water with me in this race either. And so I got to make sure I'm weighed down so I can move really quick for the full 5 miles. And so I get to the starting line, and you would think I'm getting some hints here pretty quick. I am a little nervous because I start looking around. I'm on my $80 Kmart special and my freebie helmet that I got in elementary school. And I'm looking around, and I see guys riding $1,000 plus bikes, and they've all got their camelbacks, the fancy backpacks with a straw. They've got their water with them. They're smashing gel packs, like energy packs, before they're about to take off. They have fancy equipment and speedometers on their bikes and computers, and I'm not quite getting the hint yet. I'm still going to win this thing. And so the gun goes off, and I take off, and my philosophy went as it took off. I don't want to take off with the leaders. I don't want to burn out too quickly. And I certainly don't want to start at the back, because then I'm going to get stuck behind a bunch of slow people. And so I'm just going to kind of settle in midway through this race. And everything went great for about a mile. And about that point, I'm starting to get a little tired and wishing I had a drink with me, but I'm tough. I'm a young teenage kid. I got this. And so I keep riding right along in this race. And as I'm getting tired, I'm slowing down a little, and I get past here and there, but I'm still mid-pack. And then I get to mile 3, mile 4, and I'm dying. I'm starting to think, this may be it for me. I may not make it to the end of this race. And I worked my way around. I'm near the back of the pack at this point. But then I got a little bit of hope, because I passed this lady on a bike. She's probably middle-aged woman, and I'm happy I'm not in last place at this point, and I'm happy because I'm not in last. But the problem was that I passed her because she had gotten a flat tire and pulled off and fixed her tire. And then I get to about mile 5, about the time I'm ending, and as I'm coming to what I think is the finish line, I see some guys doing this. I didn't read the fact that the beginner race is a 5-mile loop, but you have to do it twice. And so I keep on going, because my pride was too big. I'm not going to stop it after the first lap. And so I just kind of continue throughout this. And there's some things I didn't prepare for. Like there were spots that they had put 6 inches of sand, and I'm just having a terrible time getting through it. I start not to get all gory on anybody, I start kind of dry heaving and stuff. I'm just stopping, not feeling good. But I keep plugging along. Mile 7, mile 8, very, very slowly, might I add. But then I lost all hope. because I thought I had that hope of that one lady that's behind me. I lost hope when this lady who had a flat tire and had pulled over, she had fixed her tire, pumped up her tire, got back on the trail, and passed me back once again and easily. She blew right on by me. And I kid you not, when I got to mile 9, throughout the course, there's guys with walkie-talkies. And I'm not kidding, this isn't a made up story. I think he thought I was out of earshot, but I passed that last little checkpoint at about mile 9, and I kind of turn the corner, and I hear him say over the walkie-talkie, "We found him. He just passed by." And then I became that kid as I crossed the finish line. Everybody's lined up clapping. They thought I had died on this 5-mile loop of a trail. And my dad told me after the fact that the director of the race was all nervous and she was concerned and she was worried, and she talked to him. And he just happened to mention, he didn't eat breakfast this morning. And her direct words were, "That dummy." And just my pride's too big. I did figure this sport out and got some new equipment, went back and did much better the next year. But it was no exaggeration. It takes about 45 minutes to ride that 10-mile race. And I finished approximately 30 minutes after the last racer. I tell you that story to tell you this, that I had 2 fatal flaws as I approached this race. Number 1, I was not prepared. I didn't know what I was signing up for. I didn't know what I was getting into. And the second one is I had no fuel. I really had no life source. I had nothing to keep me going. Now, this mountain bike race was a long distance race, and the Christian life is also a long distance race. And so oftentimes we romanticize it and we think of it like a short sprint. Like, I just have to get from here to here. If I just cross this line, I'll be good. And I'm going to begin to follow Jesus, and everything's going to be daisies and roses. But if you have been a follower of Jesus for any period of time, and if you've read through the words of Jesus, and if you've read through the words of Paul, and if you've read through the New Testament letters, you know that being a follower of Jesus is not an easy thing. The Christian life is a marathon. It's a long-distance race, and it's hard. And I set all that up to point us to a text. And I'm just going to be honest, I think all 5 topics that we have and we've been talking about this week in the subject of refocusing as the church, if there's one subject for any of us to take away, it's this one today. Because in order for us to live out this long distance race, we really only have one task. One foundational task. And unfortunately, it can be one that we begin to neglect. Let's look at what that is. It comes from John chapter 15. To set up the text, he's about to go to the cross. This is like lessons from the upper room sort of thing. Right before he heads to the garden and he begins to plead with his Father and wrestle with his Father in heaven about his will or the Father's will. And right before he gets arrested, and right before he goes to the cross, and right before he is crucified, he has some teaching for his disciples. And it could not be any more relevant to us today. So what are some of the words that Jesus has to say right before his earthly end? Here's part of it. John chapter 15, the first 8 verses. Here's what it says. Jesus says, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be given, It'll be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. There's a pretty clear goal of this text. There's a pretty clear end game, and the end game here is to bear fruit. But we're in southern Missouri here. We're in an agricultural area. We understand that in order for something to bear fruit, that it has to grow first. That there's a growing process that takes place before fruit shows up. And here's the thing about growth. No one can do it for you. When it comes to our own spiritual growth, when it comes to our own walks with Jesus, we so often want to play the blame game. It's the preacher's fault. It's the leadership's fault. It's my church's fault. It's my circumstances' fault. We have all sorts of reasons that we give. But nobody can grow for you. And here's the other thing about growth that I think is quite foundational and important for us to understand up front. The other thing about growth is, for me, here I am. I'm a millennial. In a lot of ways, I struggle with some of the same generational millennial traps that, frankly, maybe all younger generations have always experienced. But here's one thing that I know about what I have struggled with is, I'll see someone that's further along in their faith than me. I'll see some sort of role model or some sort of example, and I want to be like them just like that. So what do? I try to imitate them. I do the things that they do, and that's not all bad. But over the last few years, here's what I've learned about growth is a process. It takes time, and it takes our intentionality today. Sometimes we look at people that are further along. I remember, a lot of you guys know the name Woody Wilkinson. I remember sitting in class at Ozark Christian College, and I remember him saying something along these lines. He said, I will never know. I will never be all that I want to be on this side of heaven. And I almost threw my hands up and walked out of class and all right, there's no hope for me. Because if Woody Wilkinson has more growing to do, there's no hope for me. But over the last few years, something that God has taught me is the realization that if I want to become a faithful example like Woody Wilkinson, it has to start with some intentionality today. That so often we look at where we want to be 10 years from now, and tomorrow it's still going to be 10 years from now, and a year from now it's still going to be 10 years from now. It's funny how contentment or how where we want to be is always just an extra buck further down the road or a few more years down the road. The reality is no one can grow for you, and growth requires our initiative starting today. So the question here is, if the goal of this text is to bear fruit, and bearing fruit requires growth on our part, how do you do that? The text is actually really, really clear, and it actually gives us only one role. That there's three characters in this sort of parabolic message that Jesus has. The first character we have is the gardener. He actually talks about himself first as the vine, but let's start with the gardener. And the role of the gardener was simply to prune. It was to take care of the garden. It was to cut off the branches that weren't any good, that weren't bearing any fruit, so that the others could get better. And then there's the vine, and the role of the vine is to supply the lifeblood, to the resources, to the branches, which because of the gardener's work and because of the life that's provided from the source of life, the vine, then the branches can grow. Here's one of my favorite questions to ask of this text, that there's always two answers, and especially when I was talking to youth a lot on this subject, I don't think I ever got the right answer the first time. I asked the question, so the role of the gardener is to prune, is to take care of the garden. The role of the vine is to offer the life to the branches. What's the role of the branches? And almost always, here's the answer that you get. The role of the branches is to bear fruit. That's not what this text says. This text does not say that the role of the branch is to bear fruit. The role of the branch is very specific. It's very clear, it's very obvious, and it's really very simple for us to do. That the role of the branches is one thing, and that is to stay attached to the vine. The role of the branch is to stay attached to the vine. Because it's when you attach the life source, then you will bear fruit. It's really not a complicated thing for us to understand. But if we are going to refocus, if we're going to revive, we're going to revitalize, if we're going to be the church that we got to be, there's a very foundational truth here that we cannot forget. And that is that our number one job is to cling to Christ. I don't know if you saw last night, but if you have kids or grandkids, you can have the image of clinging quite well. That there's from time to time that your kid just wants to cling to your leg and they will not let go, especially if they're scared. And yet that's what we're called to do with Christ. Cling and not let go. That's like when my kid is attached to my leg, they take a step every time I do. If they're attached to my hip, everywhere I go, they're going to come with me. And that's exactly what we're called to do in our relationship with Jesus. That our primary role is to cling to Christ. And when we cling to the vine, then we will bear fruit with our lives. Ever wonder why it seems that there are, which by the way, it's more than what we think it is, but it's always the things that make the headlines. You ever wonder why seemingly effective Christian leaders can fall to moral failure? It's this right here. Is that we can transition, we can fix it, we can change our perspective or change our mindset to we need to bear fruit. And if we focus then on bearing fruit, then we've taken our eyes actually off of Jesus. We've actually unattached from Christ. That Christian leaders and followers of Jesus will fall to moral failure when they've tried to bear fruit without first clinging to Christ. I was at a conference in Orlando this past year, and there was like one really clear takeaway for me as a church leader, and it came from the voice of a gal named Jody Hickerson, and here's what she said. She said, the greatest strategy of the enemy is to get us to do the work of God without God at work in us. The greatest strategy of the enemy is to get us to do the work of God without first the work of God in us. Let's not miss a couple key verses in John chapter 15. Jesus says in John 15:5, verse 5, he says, apart from me, you can do nothing. Verse 4, he says, no branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. That we have one foundational role as followers of Jesus. And it's quite obvious, I think, why Jesus would go to this message to these disciples before he goes to the cross, because they're about to face some difficulty. Like persecution's about to be really real. They're about to really doubt, was he really who he said he was? They're about to really face some dark times, some difficulty. And he had one message for them. He said, remain in me. Cling to me. Don't let me out of sight. Mark Moore writes this. He says, by clinging to Christ, we will bear fruit. So don't miss that. Like the point isn't that bearing fruit isn't important. It's actually just the opposite. That if we truly want to bear fruit for the kingdom, if we truly want to have eternal impact on this temporal world, we have to cling to Christ. And too often we get it backwards. We begin thinking that, no, I got to muster my creativity. I got to muster my courage. I've got to focus on doing all the right things. It's interesting that when you look at texts like the fruit of the Spirit, like I'm not saying we don't have roles to do. In fact, Mark Moore, as I finish this quote, is going to tell us this. I'm not saying that we don't have like some intentionality to do here. I'm not saying we don't have work to do here. But when we look at the fruit of the Spirit, so often we skip what the fruit is of. We look at love, joy, peace, patience, and we think, I got to do those things. But may we not forget that that's not the fruit of Devin Robertson. That's the fruit of the Spirit. That those fruits will be demonstrated in our life when we first cling to Christ. And too often we try to produce those things under our own effort, our own creativity. Back to Mark Moore's quote, by clinging to Christ we will bear fruit. It is not automatic, but it is inevitable. That is to say, although it will require effort on our part, there is no question that all true disciples are fruitful. Just as branches connected to a vine produce grapes, so a Christian connected to Jesus bears fruit. This fruit includes things such as Christian character, righteous living, deeds of kindness, conversion, and praise offered up to God. By clinging to Christ, we will bear fruit. It's not automatic, but it is inevitable. And the scary truth that Jesus gives us in this text is that those who externally look like Christians but bear no fruit will be cut off. On the flip side, when we cling to Christ, we will look more like Christ. When we cling to Christ, we will look like Christ. 1 John 2:6 says, for all who claim the name Jesus, for all who claim the name Christian, for all who claim to be a follower, will walk as Jesus walked. Not merely by our own power, but by clinging to Christ, the Spirit will work in us. It was the cheesiest thing. I should probably tell Matt Proctor, president of Ozark Christian, I should probably tell him. I make fun of him all the time, but I'm going to do it again. It was the cheesiest thing in our Christian life class that he would always say at the beginning of our class. He would just say throughout this phrase, he probably still does it. He goes, it's morphin' time, and we'd all go, we shall morph indeed. It was the cheesiest thing, and yet it's so true. Because what the Christian life is as we cling to Christ, God continually molds us more and more into the image of Jesus. That the more we cling, the more we look like him, the more we will bear fruit in the lives that we live. And here's another foundational truth that comes from Michael DeFazio. He says, long before we walk away from Christ, we take our eyes off of him. Long before we walk away from Christ, we take our eyes off of him. With each passing year, as we look back on year 2019, 2018, 2017, with each passing year, we should be able to see progress. We should be able to see how God has continued to mold us and to make us more Christ-like. Because growth is inevitable when we cling to Christ. And too easily we can get involved in a mission creep, as we talked about a couple of nights ago, and we can begin focusing on wrong areas. Kyle Eidelman tells a story about a Texas man with a big old belt buckle, and he walks up to Kyle, and he was broken and he was hurting because his daughter had become a prodigal and she had walked away from her faith and she had walked away from the church. And as he's telling the story to Kyle, he threw out this statement, which I think is so fundamental for us to grasp. He said this. He said, we raised her in church, but we didn't raise her in Christ. We raised her in church, but we didn't raise her in Christ. See, religious expression alone does not produce Christ-likeness, but clinging to Christ will always produce kingdom fruit. Religious expression alone does not produce Christ-likeness, but clinging to Christ will always produce kingdom fruit in our lives. What's the message? It's really quite clear today. Cling to Christ. There was once a 90-year-old man on a moped. That's where you know the story's not real. There was once a 90-year-old man on a moped, and he pulled up to the stoplight, and right next to him in the next lane was this younger guy who was driving a brand new cherry red, beautiful Ferrari. I mean, this baby cost $250,000. It could go to 0 to 60 in next to nothing. And as this old man sat there, apparently it was a stoplight in Jackson, Michigan, because it never turned green. They were just kind of sitting there. And this older guy gets off his moped, and he comes over to the guy's car and says, "Wow, what an amazing car. Can I take a look?" And he begins to wander around. This older guy, very slowly, might I add. He kind of walks around real slowly. He goes around this car, checking it out, inside and out. He asks him to rev it up. He thinks it just sounds wonderful. It sounds great. He peeks in the window, and he is just amazed by this amazing car. And he says to the young guy, "Thank you so much for the opportunity for me to look at your car." And so he gets back on his moped, and the young guy's like, "Now I'm going to show him for real what this thing can do." And so just like we all do, he's watching the lights on the side, and it's green, and then it turns yellow, and then it turns red, which you have a couple seconds, and your light's going to turn green. And it turns green. As soon as it does, the guy in the Ferrari stomps on it, and it takes off. He goes flying 0 to 60 in next to nothing. And he just keeps on flooring it, going down the road. But then he's kind of baffled because he looks in the rearview mirror. And he sees this little dot coming up on him. It's catching him, and it's catching him pretty quickly. And then he gets kind of mad because it comes right on by him, and it was the 90-year-old man on a moped. And he goes, "I didn't spend $250,000 to get beat by an old guy on a moped." And so he stomps on it once again. He goes flying by this guy on the moped. He's going down. Now he's going 100, 110, 120 down the road. He's pulling away. He looks in the rearview mirror, and sure enough, here he comes again. Here comes the old man on the moped. He's like, "I'm not having it this time." And so he stomps on it. Now he's going 150, 160, 170. When all of a sudden there's a great big crash. The old man plowed right back in the back of his car. And as only can happen in a made-up story, the young guy gets out, and the old man's still alive. And the young guy goes to the old man and says, Sir, are you okay? Is there anything I can do to help you? Do I need to call an ambulance? Is there something that I need to do? What can I do to help you? Are you okay? Are you alert? What can I do to help you?" And the old man goes, "Yes. Can you please remove my suspenders from your mirror?" Go ahead and let it work out there for just a second. If you will, I think what we need to do more than anything else is to hook our suspenders to Jesus. Because he wants to go far faster. He wants to go far further. He wants to do far more through us than we could ever do on our own. That what we need to do is simply to cling to Christ. He wants to transform Walker, Missouri. He wants to transform Nevada, Missouri. He wants to transform Vernon County. And our role as the church, as each one of us individually, is to cling to Christ. And maybe at this point you're asking the question, well, how? Let's just talk about that for a little while for the rest of our time. Let's talk about the how. How do we cling to Christ? I'm just going to be honest. These are Sunday school answers, but they have radical impact on our life. Here we go. How do you cling to Christ? Number one, cling to Christ by clinging to his word. Don't let a day go by without spending time in it. Reading the words of life. Like if I'm too busy. No, you're too busy not to. Set an appointment. Like if you're like me, I was going to grab it, but I don't have it with me. If you're like me, I'll have that little ding go off my phone, and I panic. Oh, no, what did I forget? Because I schedule everything. Everything is in my phone. If that's you, schedule Jesus on your calendar to start. Put him there and don't miss the appointment. You wouldn't miss a date with your wife. You wouldn't miss a date with your significant other. You wouldn't miss some important business meeting. What can be more important than spending time with the King of the universe, the one who offers the source of life, the one that we're to cling to and as a result bear fruit? Put it on your calendar if you have to. Cling to Christ by clinging to his word. What did the text say? The text said, if you will remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. There can be a lot of debating, a lot of discussion about what bear fruit is. I think it's kind of all in the above of the things that we debate. But just by spending time in Scripture alone, bears fruit. We may not think it does. Like I talk to people in my church, they go, I've tried it before, it just doesn't do anything for me. Like I've tried the whole Bible thing. Just, it's not. And you know what? Usually people that would, in fact, probably always, people that would say that to me have tried it once. I tried to read the Bible once. Didn't do much for me. Well, there's a really interesting study that was done by the Center for Bible Engagement. And they polled 40,000 people from the age of 8 to 80. And their poll, they were trying to figure out, like, people interacting with the word, and there was kind of a byproduct of this that they didn't intend at this study, but there was a huge finding that came out of it. And here's the funny finding, that when you cling to Christ, through clinging to his word, you will bear much fruit. That they found that when someone read the Bible once a week or twice a week, it had very little impact. And by the way, when I say read the Bible, that includes like Sunday morning. Like if you spend time in the Word 1 or 2 times a week, it said it had negligible effect, not much at all on someone's life. If you spend time in the Word 3 times a week, there was a blip on the radar. There was some impact that had on people's life. But here was that crazy finding for them, that if you spent time in the Word, whether it's preaching, whether it's time alone, or whether it's time in Bible study, whatever it may be, that if you spent time in the Word 4 times a week, lives drastically changed. Here are just some of the stats that they found. Feeling lonely. Talk about a problem in our culture. Loneliness, isolation. Feeling lonely dropped by 30%. From people who didn't spend time in the Word 4 times a week to those that did. Anger issues, for people who spent time in the Word 4 times a week, it dropped by 32%. Bitterness in relationships dropped by 40%. Alcoholism dropped by 57%. Feeling spiritually stagnant. This is a good one for us to hang on here for just a second. How many of us and how often do we feel spiritually stagnant? Often. What does this tell us? That if you feel stagnant in your faith, if you feel stagnant in your journey with Jesus, spend time clinging to Christ through clinging to his word at least 4 times a week, because if you feel spiritually stagnant, stagnation dropped by 60%. Viewing pornography dropped by 61%. But these weren't just negative things that stopped. There was also positive things that started. That those that spent time in the Word at least 4 times a week, sharing their faith, increased by 200%. People that were discipling others, that were walking with Jesus and saying, hey, walk with me as I walk with Christ, and let me help you do that too. Discipling others increased by 230%. Like we so often view like, yeah, I know, the Sunday school answer, I'm supposed to read my Bible. No, this is far more than that. These are the words of life. Cling to Christ by spending time with the clearest way that he has revealed himself to us. Make it a goal. Let's not go another week without spending time in the Word at least 4 times. Like we so oftentimes view our spiritual life like the Sunday morning. That's my spiritual fix. Let's go back to Sunday morning, where we talked about how oftentimes we think of our life in compartments. We think of it like in drawers in a dresser. That we've got our family life, we've got our work life, we've got our spiritual life. But the reality is Jesus doesn't want to be a drawer within the dresser of our life. He wants to be the entire drawer that every dresser fits into. And so what we'll do is that when we see our Jesus as just a drawer, we'll begin to think of like, well, my spiritual fix is when I get on Sunday. You know, Jesus calls himself the bread of life. None of us would be satisfied with eating 1 time a week. None of us would be satisfied with eating 1 meal a week. You wouldn't even be satisfied being super spiritual. And I do a life group, I do a small group. That's 2 times a week. I'm super spiritual. Okay, so you survive off 2 meals a week. We got to spend time in the Word daily. Don't let another week go by without at least spending 4 times in the Word. Cling to Christ by clinging to the word. Second, cling to Christ by clinging to God in prayer. There was once a cab driver and a minister standing in line to get into heaven. The bus driver, the cab driver approached the gate, and St. Peter says, "Welcome, I understand that you were a cab driver." He said, "Since I'm in charge of housing, I believe I have found the perfect place for you. See that mansion over there, over the hilltop? That's yours." The minister heard all this and begins to stand a little taller, and he thinks to himself, well, if that cab driver got that mansion, what am I, a minister? How much greater is my place going to be? And St. Peter looked to him and said, "Welcome, I understand you were a minister. See that shack in the valley?" St. Peter was frustrated. He couldn't hardly get the words out of his mouth, and he was just irate. He said to St. Peter, "I was a minister. He said, I preached the gospel. I helped teach about God. Why does this cab driver get a mansion and I get a shack?" To which St. Peter responded, "Well, it seems that when you preached, people slept. But when this cab driver drove, people prayed." See, we oftentimes will view our prayer life just in the case of emergencies, just when things are trying or difficult or frustrating or when there's some sort of emergency at hand. But prayer was intended for so much more than that. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, he just tells us two simple words: pray continually. Paul says in Colossians chapter 4, he says, devote yourselves to prayer. I love what Dallas Willard says. He says, prayer is talking to God about what you're doing together. Prayer is talking to God simply about what you and him are doing together. There's not a day that goes by that I don't talk to my wife throughout the day. Whether it's through text, whether it's FaceTime, whether it's a phone call, that I'm constantly communicating with my wife. And yet sometimes it's convicting to me to wrestle with the thought of, how come I don't talk to God like that throughout my day? Jim Simba says, the devil is not terribly frightened of our human efforts and credentials, but he knows his kingdom will be damaged when we begin to lift up our hearts to God. Cling to Christ through prayer. And here's the last piece, and one that should not go neglected. Cling to Christ by clinging to his word. Cling to Christ through clinging to God in prayer. And third, cling to Christ by clinging to each other. We've got to stop being a church that is so content with just seeing each other across the room on a Sunday morning. That our walks and our relationship with God perhaps isn't quite where it needs to be if we don't desperately need another believer walking alongside each other. Travel in a pack. I talked the other night in quoting Hebrews that the author says that Satan is prowling around like a roaring lion. Not only does Satan not stand out in the tall grass, jumping up and down, saying, "Here I am," but he also doesn't attack a pack. What does a lion attack? It's the one that's isolated off by themselves. On the contrary, when animals that he's about to attack actually will turn on a lion, they'll take off. It's when we get ourselves isolated, when we think it can just be me and Jesus, when it's just kind of me, myself, and I, when we get into that, we are never more vulnerable to all sorts of sin. We're never more vulnerable to being attacked by the enemy. It's when we get ourselves isolated that we begin to walk from Christ. God has taught Sarah and I a lot over the years of clinging to other people as we journey in our in our faith. And we've got a group that meets in our house, and they don't just, I mentioned the other night about hospitality. We don't just meet every Friday, though we do that too. In fact, there's probably been people in our group in and out of our house while we've been gone for the last 2 weeks. It's just kind of, we just sort of do life together. But just in the last couple of years, just in my group, let alone the other groups like part of my church or other churches, here's what we've seen happen. We've seen marriages strengthened. We've seen restored marriages. You wouldn't believe some of the circumstances that have taken place. In one particular marriage, you would think it was unredeemable and there's nothing that can be done, but by walking together with each other, encouraging one another, we've gotten the opportunity to be a part of being a part of a restored marriage. We've prayed over major medical issues. We've partnered together to reach others. We've urged and experienced first-time decisions. We've been able to meet some needs in the community. We've been able to just be a family and sit around bonfires. We've been able to encourage one another and correct one another using Scripture. We have laughed together. We've cried together. We've prayed together. We've celebrated together. One of my favorite moments, I should have brought this picture and shared it, was like nobody planned it, but when somebody in our group, when it just happens to be like somebody's birthday, nobody plans it, but all of a sudden a cake will show up. All of a sudden candles will show up. All of a sudden we're all gathered around a kitchen and we're celebrating somebody's birthday. It just happened to be my oldest daughter. It's just what you do when you do life together. That when there's something to celebrate, you celebrate as a family. See, here's the reality. There's no such thing as a solo Christian. Alistair Begg says it so well. Here's what he says. He says, there are no freelance Christians. There is no solo flying to heaven. There are no freelance Christians. There is no solo flying to heaven. Cling to Christ through his word, through prayer, and cling to Christ by clinging to each other. Be real, be authentic, share with one another what's going on in your life. Share the questions, the doubts, share what's going on. When someone disengages, when you don't see them anymore, tap them on the shoulder, find out what's going on, find out what they need. The Christian life is not a solo sport, it's a team sport. Cling to Christ. In C.S. Lewis's famous book, Mere Christianity, he says, God came to this world and became a man in order to spread to other men the kind of life he has, by what C.S. Lewis called the good infection. And then he says this, every Christian is to become a little Christ. Every Christian is to become a little Christ. The whole purpose of becoming a Christian is simply nothing else. Cling to Christ. And then we will bear much fruit. See, long before we walk away from Christ, we take our eyes off of him. And it dawned on me just about 2 hours ago, as I wrestle with that statement, that long before we walk away from Christ, we take our eyes off of him. That might mean that there's people in this room that have taken their eyes off of Christ. Long before we walk away from Christ, we take our eyes off of him. May you wrestle with that truth now. And cling to Christ. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit. If you don't hear anything else this week, if you don't take anything else home, if you don't do anything at all with what I've said, hear this one. Cling to Christ. Let's pray. God, I pray that even right now that you would begin working in each one of our lives, each one of our hearts, and that you would just search our hearts and show us where there may be some wayward ways within us. God, if there's a conversation that we need to have tonight with someone in this room, that we wouldn't leave here without that conversation. That you would just begin tapping on our heart right now and make it very clear that if we've taken our eyes off of you, would you help us to align our lives with someone else, to cling together as we cling to you. God, work in us and through us. Help us to surrender fully to you. That way we can align our hearts with you. That way we can see people the way that you see them. God, may we be a church that above all else is determined to cling to your Son Jesus. And in so doing, we will bear much fruit. God, I pray all this in your Son's name. Amen.